So the next speaker is Deb Chapman. And many of you know Deb as a counselor in Ward 9 in Kitchener, and that's how I knew Deb. But then Deb invited me to come out and speak. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it to her class at Laurier to talk about amalgamation. And so I said, oh, I didn't know Deb taught at the university. So she's here with two hats, her academic hat and her elected official hat. So Deb, we're going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. My area of research is actually on Latin American studies. So I'm teaching a course on urban politics, which I've really quite enjoyed because of my role as a city councillor. So my position is, and I think the most important thing that I want to say here tonight is that any decision to amalgamate, in my view, should be done locally through a referendum or through public consultation. And unfortunately, it's usually forced on municipalities by provincial governments. And as we saw from the local referendum results in 2011, when people were asked if they would like to see amalgamation talks opened up, it was a very divisive topic. The Kitchener voters voted 2-1 in favor of opening up talks about amalgamation, whereas in Waterloo, they voted 2-1 against. So I think moving forward, further consultation would be required to get a better understanding of how residents in the region would benefit or not from amalgamation. One thing is amalgamation of services and projects, and another is amalgamation of government. And I think it's important to make the distinction of the two types of amalgamation that we could engage with. When amalgamating governments, for example, representation is moved further away from the people, which clearly weakens local democracy. Electors would have less access to government. Elected representatives would have to cover a much larger and more populated area. And of course, the distribution or allocation of funds would also change. Amalgamating projects and services is a different sort of arrangement where there could be mutual benefit to all the municipalities or both municipalities involved. Kitchener and Waterloo, the two cities that were participated in the 2011 referendum, are already engaged in several joint projects. And you can actually see the list of these projects and services on Kitchener's website. So here are some examples of what's already being done jointly. So they're working on adopting and implementing a Vision Zero approach to support the goal of zero traffic fatalities. They're working jointly on trying to come up with a plan for inclusionary zoning. Is it something that will be adopted? What are the parameters and the guidelines of such a zoning bylaw? They're collaborating on an effort on an affordable housing strategy and program. In addition to these programs, there are also several services that are worked on collaboratively. So the maintenance of the 20 border streets, and this was news to me as I was preparing for this presentation. There are 20 border streets between Kitchener and Waterloo, which includes snow removal. So they maintain them jointly. Or they collaborate on the maintaining of them, which includes snow removal, general upkeep, street sweeping, and leaf collection. There's a joint fire dispatch arrangement, where Kitchener actually holds the dispatch center and provides the services to Waterloo and Cambridge. And of course, those municipalities pay a fee to Kitchener, which provides the infrastructure, the hardware, the software, and the mapping data for the dispatch services. There's also a lot of lobbying efforts that happen that are coordinated and happen as a collective in support of, for example, the two-way all-day GO service from Toronto to Kitchener and high-speed rail that would be designed, if it ever happens, to foster a Toronto-Waterloo corridor. There's also the Waterloo Regional Small Business Center, which is supported through economic development and functions for both cities and other cities in the region as well. So those are some collaborative efforts that are currently being acted on. There's always the option to amalgamate services if the municipalities feel it would be beneficial. One that is often asked about is the amalgamation of fire services, but I'm not going to get into any details about that right now. Instead, I'd like to draw your attention to Bill 39, and Robert Deutschman sort of mentioned it earlier in his introduction. It's also referred to as the Better Municipal Governance Act, and it was passed in December 2022. On November 16th, the Minister of Municipal Affairs announced that it would look to expand the strong mayor's provision, which came under Bill 3, to other municipalities. And as you may know, Bill 3 gives unprecedented powers to the mayors of Toronto and Ottawa. The details of Bill 39 are still being worked out, but the provincial government will name provincially appointed facilitators, as was mentioned earlier, who will assess the regional governments of Durham, Niagara, Peel, Waterloo, and York. The minister stated that the facilitators would be tasked with determining the best mix of roles and responsibilities between the upper and lower tier municipalities in those regions. So in Bill 39, there is no mention of amalgamation. However, I think we could assume that anything could come out of their final assessment, including amalgamation. I also wanted to touch on de-amalgamation. This was an article I actually asked my students to read, and Zach Spicer and Lydia Miljan actually did a study in 2003 titled De-Amalgamation in Canada. And I asked Zach before this talk if it was okay if I spoke to this, if he wasn't going to, and he was okay with that. So here we go. And they examined de-amalgamation in a couple of, well, two case studies, which I'll get to in a moment. But I just, in the introduction to their article, they state that a vast amount of research has found that consolidation or amalgamation fails to produce promised cost savings. It rarely leads to more efficient service delivery, and it reduces the ability of citizens to be involved in the life of their local government. But they also acknowledge that de-amalgamation can be very costly. There is no guarantee that de-amalgamated municipalities would be any more efficient than the amalgamated city that preceded it. And that there's no guarantee that local communities would buy into it, which is always a big thing when it comes to the discussion of amalgamation, or in this case, de-amalgamation. It's getting people on side. Their study looks at two cases of de-amalgamation, and I just wanted to touch briefly on the Montreal, Quebec case, because I found it to be quite interesting. In 2001, Quebec passed a bill, Bill 107, which consolidated 213 municipalities into 42. The most significant was the island of Montreal, where all 28 municipalities were merged to create a new Montreal megacity. Leading up to the 2003 provincial election, Jean Charest, who was the head of the Quebec Liberal Party at the time, supported a motion at their convention calling for de-amalgamation. He argued that the merger plan was heavy-handed and largely excluded the public. One of his campaign promises was to provide a mechanism for de-amalgamation. He said, "The Liberal Party has promised, once it forms a government, that it will allow the citizens who have been victims of these forced mergers to speak and undo what the Parti Québécois has done." The Liberal Party went on to win the election, and they proceeded by passing a law requiring citizen consultations on the territorial reorganization that would allow municipalities to de-amalgamate if they met specific conditions. And the end result was that 31 municipalities, 13 of which were on the island of Montreal, opted for de-amalgamation. The Charest government restored independence in January 2006. The second example, which I won't go into in any detail, is in Headingley, a small rural community just west of Winnipeg, Manitoba, which was forced into amalgamation with Winnipeg in 1971. In 1991, after a very drawn-out process, they also succeeded in de-amalgamating from the larger city of Winnipeg. In this case, it was more because of the rural-urban differences that existed between the two different municipalities. McGann and Spicer conclude that it is important to carefully examine the benefits of amalgamation because once implemented, this type of restructuring is very difficult to reverse without significant cost and challenges. So I just wanted to conclude here with some questions that I think should be asked if and when amalgamation is contemplated. And the first four items that I'll mention have all been clearly identified as priorities by the local governments here in the region. So the questions I think we need to think about are, would amalgamation address the affordable housing crisis? Would amalgamation address homelessness? Would amalgamation make for a more equitable society? Would amalgamation serve to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and address the climate emergency, which all municipalities in the region declared in 2019? Also, how would amalgamation impact the democratic process? And perhaps most importantly, who benefits? I'll leave it at that. And thank you. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Deb, for that. Those are some excellent questions. Interesting you brought up the equity issue, which was something that Zach had touched on. And Zach, your hands are all over this thing over the decades. So we have the right person here with us in terms of knowledge and experience. Going to have you back for sure to future town hall. It's interesting, Deb, because we talk about. Well, first off, I just wanted to mention anecdotally when I was speaking with a mayor on the referendum that was held about whether you wanted to have a discussion about amalgamation between Kitchener and Waterloo. A mayor thought that the relationship between the mayors of the two cities may have had some impact on how that vote went. And if there was a situation like a more collaborative situation, like we see with Barry and Dave Jaworski, Barry Verbanovic and Dave Jaworski, and how closely they work together, the outcome of that might have been both groups saying, yes, let's have that conversation, because the image of their two leaders working collaboratively and closely together on a lot of things. So that was kind of interesting. There were some very interesting comments in the chat box too. Jason Hammond and Melissa B talked about some examples of where there is collaboration going on. But Rose Greensides brought up, I thought, a very interesting point, which is about social services having to deal with 8 different governments sometimes and 60 different political office holders in order to get services online or to get some assistance. And so that's an example, I guess, where trying to make an equitable community dealing with homelessness, drug addiction, mental health issues, et cetera, and trying to get the supports for that makes it difficult when you have to go to all these different tiers of government. Do you see that point?
Yeah, I mean, as you're saying that, another one that I've often heard reference of is the arts community, arts and culture, right? To get funding for different projects, they end up having to submit applications to many different levels of government. So yeah, there is that reality, right? That arises with a two-tiered system for sure.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, for example, Mary Jane Patterson and REAP just recently going around to all the different municipalities to do presentations. Like they've got to do 8 different presentations to advise as to what they're up to and what they're doing. And yeah, so it makes it's a very interesting situation. Almost more work than is necessary sometimes.
I go back to the questions that I think are important to ask, right? Like if we look at our strategic plans and the things that we hope to accomplish over the next 4 years or 10 years in some cases, what are these items that we're concerned about? Would amalgamation solve them? And
Yeah.
that seems the big question. And that's why I think it's very important to bring these things back down to the local level, and that they not be dictated by the province.
And when you say who's benefiting, what can you give a little bit more about that? What you mean by
That's the
that?
question that we have to ask. That's the question we have to ask. I'll leave it at, I'm not going to answer that question.
Some conspiracy theorists might say that's a loaded question.
It is a loaded question, but it's
Yes.
real, right? It's real.
Yes. Okay. Thanks for all of that.